Emma Daniels had never imagined that her life would amount to anything more than the daily grind of working at the small-town diner and caring for her aging mother. Every morning, she rose before the sun, put on her waitress uniform, and spent long hours in a world that felt both small and endless. The diner was a staple in the town, a place where the local community gathered for hot coffee and gossip, and where Emma had spent the better part of her adult life serving food, wiping tables, and listening to the stories of people whose lives were as ordinary as her own. She had long ago accepted her role as a fixture in the diner, a background character in a world of simple routines. Her life was one of modest means, but there was a quiet pride in knowing she had a job, a roof over her head, and her mother to care for. Emma's mother, Margaret, had been in failing health for the last few years. Arthritis had made it difficult for her to get around, and dementia had started to steal away the parts of her mind that once held a sharp clarity. Emma's heart ached for her mother, who had raised her with love and sacrifice, but it was hard. Emma juggled her responsibilities at the diner with caring for her mother, making sure Margaret had her meals, took her medication, and was comfortable in their small, cluttered home. There was no time for anything beyond that. She had let go of her own dreams long ago, convinced that she wasn't meant for anything more than this. The hope for something better had withered away, replaced by a constant, grinding focus on survival. Her life had become a series of small routines, preparing coffee for the regulars, making sure the orders were correct, and chatting with the customers as best as she could. Despite the exhaustion, despite the weariness that clung to her every bone, Emma always wore a smile. It was second nature to her by now, a mask she had perfected over the years. Her generosity, though, was real. She had learned to be kind, to offer warmth and understanding, even when her own heart was heavy. Emma had always believed that no matter how hard life became, kindness was something she could always give, even if it was just a smile or a few kind words. But the weight of her responsibilities was becoming unbearable. Every week, her paycheck seemed to stretch a little less, and every day, the burden of caring for her mother grew a little heavier. Emma had dreams once. She had thought about going to college, becoming something more than a waitress. But that was before her mother's illness had taken over. That was before the bills had piled up, and before Emma had been forced to put her life on hold, one obligation after another. Now, every day felt like an extension of the one before it, the hours slipping by unnoticed as she moved through the motions, her own hopes and desires slowly slipping into the background. One rainy evening, just as Emma was preparing to close the diner for the night, two children walked in. A boy and a girl, their faces pale and tear-streaked, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. They couldn't have been more than 10 and 12, respectively. The boy, Jake, clutched the girl's hand tightly, as if she were the only thing holding him together. The girl, Lily, was shaking slightly, her small body trembling in the cool air. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice soft and full of concern as she walked toward them. The girl nodded, but Emma could see that she wasn't okay. The dark circles under her eyes, the way she kept glancing around, the way the boy never let go of her hand, they were terrified. "I'm sorry," the boy muttered, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean to come in, we just didn't know where else to go." Emma's heart broke. It was clear that something had happened, something terrible. She asked them gently if they were hungry, offering them a seat at the counter. As she set down 2 plates of food in front of them, she could see their trembling hands and the way their eyes darted to the door every few seconds. They were frightened, lost, like they didn't know what to do next. Emma knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed by life, to feel like you were carrying a weight too heavy for your shoulders to bear. But this was different. These children were alone in the world, with no one to care for them. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She sat down across from them, her heart heavy in her chest. Lily, the older girl, swallowed hard and began to speak in a voice that barely rose above the sound of the rain outside. She explained that they had been in the car with their parents when the accident happened, a crash that had taken their lives. They had no family left, no one to turn to, and they didn't know where to go. Their parents had been traveling from out of town, and now they were stranded in a town they didn't know, with no money, no home, and no sense of what to do next. Emma's heart ached for them. She had always known that her life was hard, but she had never experienced anything like this. These children had lost everything in an instant. The grief, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss, they were raw and uncontainable in their faces. Emma knew she couldn't just send them away. She had been raised to help others, to show kindness, even when it was inconvenient, even when it hurt. Without thinking, Emma reached for the phone and called the local social services, asking for help. But as the conversation dragged on and she learned that there were no immediate foster families available, her heart began to sink. She couldn't bear the thought of these children being placed in an institution, shuffled from one place to another, feeling even more abandoned than they already were. "Lily, Jake," Emma said, her voice trembling as she made a decision that would change everything. "I don't know what to say, but you're welcome to stay with me, just for a little while. Until we figure something out." Lily's eyes widened, and Jake looked up at her, a mix of hope and disbelief crossing his face. You're not mad?" Jake asked, his voice small and unsure. "No," Emma replied, shaking her head. "No, of course not. You're safe here." The weight of the promise settled over Emma, and though she knew that taking on this responsibility would stretch her to the limit, she couldn't turn away from the children. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew that this was the right thing to do. She had always been a woman of simple means, a life lived without much fanfare, but in this moment, Emma felt a shift. A new chapter had begun, one she couldn't have anticipated. Her world, once small and predictable, was now forever changed. As Emma prepared to take the children home with her, she realized that her life had been turned upside down in the most unexpected way. The quiet, ordinary world she had known, full of routine and hardship, had been shattered by the arrival of two innocent lives, their futures now linked to hers in a way she had never imagined. Emma knew that her life would never be the same, but she also knew that, for once, she was doing something that mattered. Emma stood in the small, dimly lit kitchen of her modest apartment, the dishes from dinner still scattered on the counter. She absent-mindedly washed a plate, her thoughts racing faster than her hands could move. The orphans Lily and Jake were in the other room, tucked into their makeshift beds for the night. It had only been a few weeks since Emma had made the impulsive decision to take them in, and already, her life felt like it was spiraling out of control. Her mother's health had deteriorated over the past few months, leaving Emma to care for both her ailing parent and two children who had lost everything. She had never imagined herself in this role, never considered the possibility that she would be the one to fill the gap left by tragedy, especially not at this point in her life. Working at the diner had always been enough to get by, but now, the long hours and low wages were barely enough to keep the bills paid, let alone provide for 3 more people. The struggle to balance her job with caring for the children and her mother had worn her down. Emma had always been resilient, but now the weight of everything seemed to press down on her shoulders like an unyielding burden. She barely slept, often waking up early to prepare breakfast for the orphans before rushing off to work, where she was already exhausted from the day before. Then, after another grueling shift at the diner, she would come home to an apartment that no longer felt like a sanctuary. The children needed her mother needed her, and somehow, Emma needed to find a way to keep it all together. Despite the constant exhaustion, something in her heart was changing. When she first agreed to take Lily and Jake in, it had been a decision born from guilt and a sense of duty. But now, as she watched them slowly heal, her heart swelled with a new sense of purpose. Lily, who had been so withdrawn when she first arrived, now smiled more often, her eyes no longer filled with the same deep sadness. Jake, the younger of the two, was still hesitant, but there were moments when his guard would drop, and Emma could see the boy he might have been before the tragedy struck. She had become their protector, the mother they so desperately needed, though she had never envisioned herself as anyone's mother, least of all two children she had only recently met. It was overwhelming at times, but there was a deep satisfaction in seeing the small changes in them. They were healing, bit by bit, and Emma felt a growing bond between them, one that transcended the labels of caretaker and child. The orphans were no longer just a responsibility, they were family. However, this bond was tested every day, especially as the pressure of caring for them while also trying to maintain her own life became unbearable. Emma's work at the diner, which had once been a steady source of income, was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Her boss had noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the slower pace with which she moved. There were whispers among the staff about her performance slipping, but Emma couldn't afford to slow down, not when she had so many mouths to feed. Her financial situation was a constant source of anxiety. Between the rent, her mother's medical bills, and the additional costs of taking care of two children, Emma was barely scraping by. She had tried to make it work by cutting back on personal expenses, skipping meals, canceling plans with friends, but it was no longer enough. The days were blending together, and Emma could see the toll it was taking on her health. She had never been one to complain, but now, her body ached from the constant strain. Her sleep was fitful at best, her mind always racing with worry. As the days passed, the strain began to show in other ways. The pressure from others, well-meaning friends, co-workers, even the occasional neighbor began to intensify. They questioned how she was managing, whether she was really capable of taking care of two children when she could barely care for herself. The judgment came in subtle ways, at first an offhand comment, a raised eyebrow, but soon it became more overt. One afternoon, a co-worker asked if Emma was sure she could afford the responsibility of the orphans, as if Emma hadn't already been asking herself that question 100 times a day. The guilt and doubt settled in like a storm cloud. She loved the children, of course, but could she truly provide for them? Would they be better off somewhere else, with people who could give them everything they needed? These thoughts gnawed at her, especially when she had to stretch every dollar to make ends meet. There were days when she didn't know how much longer she could keep up the facade, pretending that everything was fine when she knew it was falling apart. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of unpaid bills that had accumulated over the past month. The numbers blurred before her eyes as the reality of her situation settled in. She couldn't keep doing this. She wasn't strong enough, not in the way she needed to be. She loved Lily and Jake, but what if she couldn't give them the future they deserved? What if, in her attempt to save them, she was actually setting them up for failure? Her heart ached as she thought about the children. They had been through so much, and she had promised them that she would take care of them, that she would be their protector. But could she keep that promise when she didn't know how to keep herself afloat? The thought of finding them a new home, a place where they could be cared for by people with more resources, seemed like a betrayal. She had promised them safety, stability, and love. How could she give that up? But at the same time, she couldn't keep pretending that she could do it all. The weight of everything was too much, and no matter how much she tried, there were days when she felt like she was barely holding on. Emma's internal struggle reached a boiling point as the tension of the last few weeks culminated in a moment of clarity. She could no longer ignore the truth: her financial situation had reached a breaking point. Something had to give, and she wasn't sure if she could sacrifice her own well-being any longer. She would have to make a decision. The options before her were painful. She could continue to push herself beyond her limits, risking her health and happiness for the sake of the children, or she could face the heart-wrenching reality that she might have to find another way to provide for them, perhaps a foster home or adoption, something that could offer them a better life than she was able to. As she sat there, the weight of the decision pressing down on her, Emma felt a deep sense of fear. She wasn't ready to let go of them, not when they had just begun to heal. But she also knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. She needed help. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of asking for it. Would it be enough to save her from the impossible choice ahead? Or would she have to risk everything, hoping that her love and determination were enough to create a new future for the three of them? As the pressure of Emma's decisions mounts, the weight of her responsibility becomes suffocating. Her heart aches with the thought of losing Lily and Jake, the two orphans who had come to mean so much to her. They had become her family, her responsibility, and her love for them was unshakable. But now, the burden of supporting them financially, emotionally, and physically was threatening to crush her. Faced with mounting medical expenses and the high cost of living, Emma made the difficult decision to take out a loan from a local bank. The money would cover their immediate needs, the medical bills that kept piling up, and the basic living expenses she couldn't otherwise afford. At first, the loan seemed like a temporary solution, a way to buy her time to figure things out. But as the months passed, the reality of the debt began to hit her harder than she anticipated. The interest rates were higher than she had expected, and the payments quickly began to accumulate. Each month, it felt like she was treading water, just barely staying afloat. The stress from the growing debt made it harder for her to focus on anything else. Every bill was a reminder of the hole she was digging for herself, and every overdue notice felt like another weight added to her shoulders. The financial strain was only the beginning. Emma's work life, which had always been a source of stability, began to unravel. Her colleagues at the office, who had once been friendly and understanding, started to criticize her for taking on too much. They saw her struggling, but instead of offering support, they began to resent her for seemingly putting her personal issues ahead of her job. They whispered behind her back, accusing her of jeopardizing her livelihood for the sake of the orphans. The harsh words from her co-workers stung, and Emma couldn't help but feel isolated. Her workplace, once a place of escape, now felt like another battleground. She could feel her energy draining, and her ability to keep up with the demands of her job was slipping. Meanwhile, the orphans' emotional well-being was deteriorating in ways Emma hadn't expected. Jake, the older of the two, had always been the more reserved of the pair. But lately, he had grown even more withdrawn. His silence was deafening, and Emma could feel the distance growing between them. He would often retreat to his room, locking the door behind him and staying there for hours. Emma couldn't reach him, she didn't know what was going on inside his mind, and the fear of losing him, the fear of losing both of them gnawed at her. Lily, on the other hand, had started to act out in school. Her once enthusiastic attitude towards learning had faded, replaced by fits of frustration and rebellion. She would lash out at her teachers, refuse to do her homework, and argue with her classmates. Emma tried to console her, but her efforts only seemed to push Lily further away. The two children, both of whom had already experienced so much trauma in their young lives, were beginning to show signs of the emotional weight they had been carrying all along. Emma knew that their behavior was a reflection of the trauma they had experienced, but she was too consumed by her own struggles to know how to help them. To make matters worse, Emma's mother, already frail and ill, began to require more care than ever before. Her mother's dependency on Emma grew, and with each passing day, Emma felt the strain of being her sole caregiver. The physical and emotional toll was overwhelming. Emma would often find herself juggling the needs of her children, her mother, and her own responsibilities, only to realize that there was no time left for herself. Her own health began to deteriorate. She wasn't sleeping, she wasn't eating properly, and she was constantly exhausted. She had become a shell of the person she once was, burned out, stressed, and filled with an ever-growing sense of desperation. In a moment of quiet reflection, Emma had an epiphany. She realized, with a gut-wrenching clarity, that she had no way out. The mountain of debt, the pressure from her co-workers, the emotional needs of Lily and Jake, and the constant care her mother required, all of it was closing in on her. She could feel the walls closing in. If things continued as they were, she would lose everything: the loan, her job, and the two children she had come to love like her own. In the depth of her despair, a solution presented itself. Emma received a call from Samuel Wright, a well-connected businessman known for helping those in need at a steep cost. Samuel was infamous for his willingness to step in when people were desperate, offering financial assistance in exchange for favors or loyalty. He had a reputation for being morally dubious, for operating in a world where ethics were often sacrificed for the sake of business. Emma knew of him, but she had always kept her distance. She had heard the rumors about him, about the people he helped, but also about the strings he attached to those helpings. Samuel's offer was simple. He could provide Emma with the funds she so desperately needed to cover the loan, pay for the children's medical bills, and get back on her feet. But the price would be steep. Samuel's help came with conditions that Emma was unsure she could meet. Would she have to work for him? Would she have to compromise her values in order to accept his assistance? The uncertainty of his offer made her stomach turn. But in her desperation, the thought of losing everything, the orphans, her job, her future, was more than she could bear. Samuel's offer seemed like the only lifeline in a sea of drowning possibilities. As she weighed the decision, the stakes grew even higher. Emma was no longer just fighting to protect her own well-being, she was fighting to protect Lily and Jake, to give them the stability and care they needed. She couldn't let them slip through her fingers, no matter the cost. But as she considered the price of accepting Samuel's help, she found herself questioning how far she was willing to go. Was she willing to sacrifice her morals, to compromise her integrity, in order to secure a future for the children? Was it worth it? The tension reached its peak as Emma was pushed to a breaking point. Every decision, every choice she made from this point forward would have lasting consequences, not just for herself, but for the orphans she had come to love as her own. The stakes were rising, and Emma knew she couldn't keep running from the choices she had to make. The time for hesitation was over. She had to decide how far she was willing to go for the orphans' sake and whether she could live with the consequences of that decision. Emma's life had always been shaped by sacrifice and responsibility. From the moment she took on the role of guardian to the orphaned children, Lily and Jake, her every decision had been made with them in mind. She had never expected to be a mother, and certainly not to two children with deep emotional scars. But she loved them fiercely and selflessly, determined to give them the care and support they needed to heal. When Samuel Wright first appeared in her life, offering financial assistance, Emma saw it as a godsend. The orphans' future had been uncertain, their needs growing with each passing day. Samuel's offer seemed like a lifeline, a way to secure their stability without risking their future. At first, Emma was hesitant. She didn't trust Samuel's motivations, but his charm, his calm demeanor, and his promises of help made it difficult for her to turn him down. After all, how could she risk the children's well-being simply out of suspicion? But as time went on, Emma began to feel the weight of his influence creeping into her life. Samuel's gestures of support began to feel less like acts of charity and more like a calculated effort to control her. He wanted more than just her gratitude, he wanted her dependence. And in the quiet moments, Emma could sense that his help came with strings attached, strings that threatened her autonomy and her ability to care for the children on her own terms. It was during one of their meetings that Samuel made his offer, an offer that forced Emma to confront a painful truth. He proposed a partnership, one that would grant him a larger stake in the orphans' inheritance. In exchange for his continued support, Emma would have to sign over a portion of her rights to the children's fortune. Samuel's words were persuasive, appealing to Emma's financial strain and her desire to provide the best future possible for the children. But as he spoke, Emma felt a sinking sensation in her chest. This was not the help she needed. If she agreed to Samuel's terms, she would be compromising everything she stood for. She had always prided herself on being a mother figure to Lily and Jake, guiding them with love and respect. But Samuel's proposal wasn't about love, it was about control. It was about turning the orphans into a commodity, something to be owned and manipulated for profit. Emma's integrity would be compromised, and her role as a mother would be reduced to that of a puppet. She couldn't allow that to happen. Just as she was grappling with the weight of her decision, Emma received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. A lawyer, representing a distant relative of the orphans, informed her that Lily and Jake had inherited a significant fortune, enough to secure their future and relieve the financial pressures that had threatened their well-being. The inheritance was a game changer, one that allowed Emma to breathe a sigh of relief. No longer would they need Samuel's help. No longer would she need to compromise her values to secure the children's future. But the relief was short-lived. The inheritance brought with it a new set of challenges. Suddenly, Emma found herself in the public eye, the media swarming to uncover the details of the orphans' newfound wealth. While the attention initially seemed like a blessing, it quickly became overwhelming. Emma had never sought fame or recognition. She had always been content to stay out of the limelight, focusing on what mattered most, Lily and Jake. Now, with the inheritance out in the open, she was forced to confront her own insecurities about her role in the children's lives. Would people see Lily and Jake for who they truly were, or would they only see the money? Would their newfound wealth overshadow everything else? As the media circus continued, Emma's personal life took a darker turn. Her mother's health deteriorated rapidly, and Emma found herself stretched thin, trying to balance the needs of the orphans with the emotional toll of caring for her ailing mother. The constant pressure mounted, and Emma began to question whether she could continue to be the mother the children needed. Her own sense of identity seemed to slip away as she became consumed by the responsibilities that now lay at her feet. In the midst of this turmoil, the children struggled to adjust to their new life. The wealth had changed them, in ways Emma hadn't anticipated. Jake, once so full of life, became distant, pushing Emma away and rejecting her attempts to care for him. Lily, too, withdrew into herself, unable to cope with the sudden changes that had upended her world. Emma had always known that their trauma ran deep, but she hadn't realized how profoundly the inheritance would affect their sense of self-worth. They no longer knew who they were. Were they the children Emma had raised, or were they now defined by their wealth? This was the true test for Emma. It wasn't just about managing money, it was about helping the children reclaim their sense of identity. She couldn't let them fall into the trap of believing that wealth could fix their problems. She needed to help them heal, to remind them that their value was not tied to material things, but to the love and resilience they had always shared. In the midst of her own grief over her mother's decline, Emma took action. She sought professional counseling for the children, hoping to help them navigate the emotional scars left by their past and the sudden shifts in their lives. Slowly, they began to open up, and together, they started to heal. Emma also realized that she, too, needed to confront her own fears and vulnerabilities. She couldn't be the strong, unwavering figure they needed if she wasn't willing to be open about her own struggles. By sharing her pain with the children, she showed them that it was okay to feel lost, to be afraid, and to need help. The journey was not easy, but Emma's determination to protect the children and build a legacy of love and integrity kept her going. As the children began to heal, Emma found herself re-examining her own role. No longer was she just a caretaker, she was a mother, a protector, and a guide. She had to create a future for them, one that was grounded in the values that had always been most important to her. Money could buy them security, but it was love, compassion, and understanding that would give them the stability they needed. By the time Samuel Wright came knocking once again, Emma had changed. The woman who had once been so easily manipulated by his charm and promises of help was no longer the same. She had grown stronger, more confident, and more capable of standing up for herself and the children. Samuel's final offer, delivered with the same air of superiority and manipulation, fell flat. Emma refused. She had found her voice, and she would not allow him to control her future or the future of the children. The resolution came in the form of a final confrontation. Emma stood her ground, unwavering in her resolve to protect the orphans' future. Samuel, defeated and unwilling to let go of the control he had once tried to exert over her, faded from the scene. Emma had won. But the real victory was not in defeating Samuel, it was in reclaiming her own life and the lives of the children she had come to love as her own. In the end, Emma built a future rooted in love, integrity, and family. The orphans thrived, not because of their wealth, but because they had found healing and a sense of self-worth. And Emma, the woman who had once felt lost and uncertain, became the mother they needed, creating a legacy that would last far longer than any inheritance. The inheritance that Emma had once hoped for finally arrives, but it's not the simple blessing she had envisioned. While the news should have been a source of immense relief, the reality is far more complicated. The weight of the newfound wealth settles heavily on her shoulders, and she is immediately thrust into a whirlwind of media attention. The small town, once indifferent to her existence, is now obsessed with the orphan's sudden fortune. Reporters flood the streets, eager to learn more about the mysterious inheritance and the children who are now its beneficiaries. What was once a quiet life for Emma and the orphans has now been overtaken by the scrutiny of the world outside their small circle. The media frenzy brings with it both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, Emma no longer faces the crushing fear of financial ruin. The inheritance promises to secure the futures of Lily, Jake, and herself, lifting them from the brink of desperation. But on the other hand, it also brings unwanted attention, drawing Emma into the spotlight in ways she isn't prepared for. Suddenly, she is the subject of interviews, her every move scrutinized, and her decisions questioned by both the press and the public. For someone who had always valued privacy and stability, the idea of being thrust into the glare of the media is overwhelming. Emma's initial relief is soon overshadowed by the realization that this attention comes at a price. She is no longer seen as the caregiver of the orphans, a woman trying to build a stable, nurturing environment for children who have suffered loss. Instead, the narrative shifts. People are no longer interested in the lives of Lily and Jake, they are focused on the wealth that has come with their inheritance. Emma begins to fear that the children will be reduced to symbols of fortune, their worth measured not by the love they give or receive but by the money they now possess. This thought weighs heavily on Emma, as she grapples with the possibility that her relationship with the children, which had always been grounded in love and mutual respect, may now be defined by their wealth. The deeper Emma reflects on the situation, the more she begins to worry about what the inheritance will do to the orphans. She fears that Lily and Jake will no longer be seen for who they truly are, kind-hearted, resilient children who have faced immense hardships. Instead, she worries that others will view them as a means to an end, objects of fascination for the media, pawns in a larger game of wealth and power. Emma can't help but wonder if the wealth will change the way the children see themselves. Will they begin to view their worth through the lens of their inheritance? And if so, how will this affect their future relationships with others? These questions haunt Emma as she tries to make sense of how the money, and the attention it brings, will alter the lives of the children she has come to love as her own. In the midst of this turmoil, Emma's personal life becomes even more complicated. Her mother's health, which had already been deteriorating, takes a sharp decline. The once vibrant woman who had always been there for Emma is now slipping away, leaving Emma with a deep sense of loss and helplessness. The reality of her mother's condition hits her hard, and the timing couldn't be worse. With the inheritance bringing its own set of pressures and responsibilities, Emma finds herself stretched thin, her attention divided between the children, the media circus, and her ailing mother. As her mother's health deteriorates, Emma is forced to confront the harsh truth that caring for the children may now require her to sacrifice more of herself than she had ever anticipated. The energy and emotional investment she has poured into the orphans is now competing with the overwhelming demands of being there for her mother. Emma, who has always been selfless in her devotion to the children, is now faced with the uncomfortable reality that she cannot do it all. The balance she had carefully maintained between caring for her family and protecting the orphans is now in jeopardy. The emotional toll begins to take its toll on Emma. She feels torn between her duties as a mother figure to Lily and Jake and her responsibilities to her own mother. The conflicting emotions weigh heavily on her. On one hand, she wants to be the strong, dependable figure the orphans need, but on the other, she feels the crushing weight of her own exhaustion and grief. Her mother's illness is a constant reminder that time is running out, and every moment spent focusing on one area of her life feels like a moment lost in another. Emma begins to question how much longer she can juggle all the roles she has taken on. Is it even possible to continue being everything to everyone, or will something have to give? The pressure on Emma continues to build. She finds herself at a crossroads, unsure of how to move forward. The inheritance, while a relief in many ways, has complicated her life in ways she never imagined. The money offers security, yes, but it also brings with it a sense of responsibility and expectation that she isn't sure she's ready for. She feels as though the more she tries to manage, the more things slip through her fingers. Her desire to keep the orphans grounded, to preserve the authenticity of their lives, is at odds with the reality of their newfound wealth and the constant public attention that comes with it. At the same time, Emma can't ignore the way the inheritance has shifted her own internal priorities. She finds herself questioning what really matters. Is it the money and the security it provides, or is it the relationships and the love that she has worked so hard to build with the orphans? She struggles with the idea that the wealth might change the way the children see their world, and the thought of losing the bond they have shared is more painful than she can express. In moments of reflection, Emma questions whether the inheritance is a gift or a curse. It promises freedom, but it also threatens to unravel the very things that have made her family and her bond with the children so special. As the chapter unfolds, Emma finds herself grappling with the painful reality that she may have to sacrifice parts of herself in order to move forward. Whether it's her personal time, her emotional energy, or the depth of her connection to the orphans, something must give. She feels the weight of her responsibilities bearing down on her, and she wonders how much longer she can balance it all. But there is also a glimmer of hope. She knows that she cannot abandon her love for the children, nor can she abandon her duty to her mother. The challenge now is figuring out how to navigate these competing demands without losing herself in the process. Emma's life takes a turbulent turn as she grapples with both external pressures and internal turmoil. What once seemed like a hopeful new chapter, with the orphans now living in a luxurious environment, quickly evolves into a struggle for stability and peace. While the wealth offers material comfort, it fails to alleviate the emotional scars the children carry or the growing sense of unease Emma feels within herself. The richness of their surroundings only magnifies the emptiness that lies beneath the surface for everyone involved. As the orphans begin to adjust to their new lives, the complex nature of their struggles becomes apparent. Jake, the older of the two orphans, becomes increasingly distant from Emma. Their previously close relationship, built on mutual dependence and love, begins to unravel. Jake, unable to process the emotional weight of his sudden change in fortune, rejects Emma's affections and pushes her away. His feelings of confusion and abandonment grow, and he lashes out, unable to reconcile the love he once had for her with the overwhelming sense of loss he still feels. His emotional state shifts from one of gratefulness to a darker place of resentment and anger, and Emma can do little but watch helplessly as he withdraws from her. Lily, on the other hand, reacts differently but equally as troubling. She becomes anxious and withdrawn, struggling to understand the drastic changes in her life. The sudden shift from poverty to wealth leaves her feeling unmoored, as if the world she once knew has been shattered beyond recognition. Unlike Jake, Lily's emotional turmoil isn't expressed through outward rejection but through an inward spiral. She becomes quiet and fearful, unable to trust the new circumstances that are meant to provide security. The luxury of their new home, the fancy clothes, and the access to privileges she had never imagined seem to only magnify her sense of displacement. She doesn't know how to reconcile this new version of herself with the girl who lived in an orphanage and had learned to survive by relying on very different values and experiences. Emma, watching both of them suffer in their own ways, feels an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She came into their lives with the intent of providing love and stability, but instead, she's found herself dealing with deeper, more complicated emotional battles. She is faced with the undeniable truth: this wealth, while solving one set of problems, has only created a new set. The trauma of the orphans' past, the loss of their parents, and the struggle to simply survive cannot be erased by money. In fact, it seems to have only deepened the psychological scars they each bear. As Emma reflects on the situation, she realizes that the true test for her isn't simply about providing material comfort or meeting external expectations. The deeper challenge is in navigating the emotional fallout of their wealth. Her own sense of purpose, her identity as a caretaker, is now entwined with her need to help them heal emotionally. She understands that money alone can't erase their pain, and that in order to truly help the children, she must address their underlying fears and trauma. She must become more than just a provider. She must become a healer, not just for them, but for herself as well. This is a realization that comes with its own set of challenges. Emma's relationship with her mother takes a tragic turn during this time, and the loss of her mother adds another layer of grief and confusion. Her mother's death comes as a shock, leaving Emma emotionally and physically exhausted. The grief overwhelms her, and she is left with a profound sense of loss that she doesn't know how to navigate. The person who had always been there to guide her, the one constant in her life, is suddenly gone. Emma finds herself questioning everything, including her ability to be the woman her mother once believed she could be. Her grief is compounded by the responsibilities that have already taken a toll on her. Now, she must also contend with the loss